It was Dallas, Texas, and the year was 1956, when a young Zan Holmes, who you'll remember perhaps if you ever took Disciple, was a seminary student at Riecke School of Theology. The campus was a segregated campus at that point in time, so Zan and his wife had to find living quarters elsewhere in Dallas. And they did. They found a small efficiency near a new highway that bisected the city. One evening, in the heat of the day, still simmering through their tiny apartment, they had their windows open when they heard the sound of a terrific, terrible crash. It was the sound in which you know something terrible is wrong. Zan ran out of the apartment and into the street when he saw that a black man was left bleeding by the side of the road. He had been left to die, hit and run. The police arrived, and an ambulance too, but this was the South of the 1950s. This was a time of segregation, a time of whites-only water fountains and strict cultural codes of behavior. So Zan stood there, waiting with the police and the ambulance workers. No one did anything. You see, there was only one company at that time in the city of Dallas that had the Negro contract. And by tradition and by law, they had to wait for that company. And by the time the Negro ambulance arrived, the man had died. Reverend Dr. Holmes, in 2002, recalled, "I looked into the eyes of those white men, and I could see the guilt and the shame in the eyes of them all. I could tell that they felt bad about it, but we were all bound by this ugly system of racism. And I was just as bound as they were, because I couldn't do anything. I couldn't do anything either. I felt anger and helplessness." This week, more than one of us has probably had those same feelings of anger and helplessness. We watch some terrible events evolve before our eyes on Facebook, MSN, Fox News, CBS, 5 o'clock news, you name it. And we realize downheartedly that the more things change, the more they stay the same. As I prepared for this morning, I wondered, what if things didn't have to remain the same? What if we really could make a difference? What if we believed we really had a choice? What if our view was the view from the ditch? It was somewhere, you see, between Jericho and Jerusalem when a Jewish man traveling alone found himself beaten near to death and thrown into a ditch by the side of the road, tossed away like so much trash. His assailants had taken what they wanted and left him for dead. Coming in and out of consciousness, this nameless victim, like so many throughout the ages, watched as people approached, looked at him lying there, and left him to die. They put their scarves in front of their faces and walked on. And he watched hopelessly as they left him. He watched as each person who could help remained silent. But unlike Dallas in 1956, almost 2,000 years later, as Jesus tells the story, in his day and time, someone showed mercy to the dying man. There was a man, an ordinary man, that saw this man in the ditch and didn't pass him by. He lifted him up, he gave him water to drink, and he tended to his wounds. No one, the one that no one expected to stop, understands it isn't about how many have passed by. This story isn't about how many passed by. man is? He doesn't care what he does for a living. He doesn't care what he believes. He doesn't care who he is or whether he prays on Saturday or Sunday, or if the man is rich or poor, or if he lives in a good neighborhood or an iffy one or a gated community or has inherited wealth. The man in the ditch only knows someone stopped to help. He has compassion. And is anything else important? Not really. This man saw someone in need, and he had compassion, and he stopped and he acted. The one least expected set aside his business, changed his schedule, and makes the dying man his priority. He dirties his own hands in the blood of another. He pays from his own pocket what was needed for the man to be healed. A man he doesn't even know. A man who was, until that moment, not his neighbor, but a stranger. This has truly been a horrible week for me. I came back from vacation, and in the words of one columnist I read, it felt like the week from hell. It really did. My cousin in Pennsylvania woke up one morning and she said, "What is going on in the world? What's happening?" And I asked those same questions myself. It was a week that tore the very fiber of our nation and our own souls. And most of us, just like myself, had gone through the happiness of the 4th of July celebration with family, and we went to work on Tuesday, ready to get back to our everyday life, ordinary life. And for most, the shooting of a complete stranger in North Baton Rouge that evening was much like all the violence that we've become accustomed to. I can tell you, as someone who moved here from Colorado a year ago, I was horrified. I'm sorry to say, but I was horrified how week after week someone was shot or stabbed in this city. I am horrified at the violence we've become used to. Just another shooting. But this time, what made it very different was a 15-year-old sobbing for his dead father. And that broke my heart. When we were just beginning to get our minds around that, another man, another stranger in another city is shot. And then if that wasn't enough, report comes, 12 officers down, 5 DOA, and a shooter pinned in a parking garage. All of them are strangers to every single one of us. So then why are we all so conflicted by the events of this week? Why do we all feel so helpless and so angry? I can tell you that I want the Good Shepherd to comfort his sheep. I want the Lord of all to stop the escalating violence. I want justice to roll down like an ever-flowing stream. I want the lion and the lamb to lay down together. But it's too soon. It's too soon. As you can see from my own emotion, we're all too raw. The problems which put us here at this crossroads cannot be solved quickly or easily. There must be time. There must be time taken to bind up the broken and wounded hearts of strangers acting out of grief and frustration. There must be time taken to offer kind words and thoughtful actions to strangers needing someone, anyone to care. There must be time to take and pour the healing oil of mercy and love over wounds of distrust and assumption. There must be time taken to pray for the victims, for the police, for the families, for our city, for our nation and world. There must be time taken to break this pattern from the past before we ever can see a brighter, better future. Zan Holmes tells them Please excuse me, most of you probably don't know him. He was a professor of mine. He was an amazing minister for 43 years in Dallas. Anyway, he tells another story. This one is about his dog, Brownie. Brownie was a little mutt that he and his wife adopted when they got their first parsonage. Now, the parsonage didn't have very much to it, just a patch of dirt in the backyard. Not wanting Brownie to run away, Zan decided to set a stake in the yard and put Brownie on a chain. And so every day when Zan would come home from church and visiting, he would go out in the backyard and he would run around the yard with the dog, and the dog would follow him in a circle, so the dog got some exercise. Each day, that's what Zan would do. And it got so that all that Zan had to do was open that back door, and Brownie ran in a circle around. One day, the chain broke, and Zan and his wife expected to never see Brownie again. But lo and behold, when they opened the back door, there was Brownie in the backyard, running the same circle. It's hard, my friends, to break with tradition, to break out of cultural patterns that have been a part of all of us for so long, or to break unspoken rules that we all live by. Then I remember that Jesus didn't care about traditions. Jesus didn't care about cultural mores. Jesus didn't care about rules that were spoken or unspoken. Jesus only cared that we love God with all our heart, mind, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. Imagine the mercy that we might receive if we could only go and do likewise. 2 weeks ago, I spoke to you of a couple of my encounters of the homeless at Warren Church on Capitol Hill in Denver. They slept on the grass of the front yard, and the stairs wells, and on the heating grates. They were always present, and there was always someone who needed help. And for the longest time, I truly believe, I had only two choices. And most of us, I think, feel this way too. Ignore them, or give them something they need. Two choices. But then I had that encounter I told you about 2 weeks ago. The stranger who only wanted a pair of boots so he could get some work and buy a bus ticket home. He made me stop and listen to him. He made me look into his eyes and truly see him. And when you take the time to look into someone else's face, to really see them, to talk with them, to get to know who they are, you discover something amazing and very important. Whether it's a policeman or a protester or an EMT or a grieving mother, you discover that we're not so very different from one another after all. We discover that we're all God's children, one in the body of Christ. We all want what everyone wants: a good home, safe family, a place to work, shelter, food enough on the table. And we learn when we take that time to get to know the other person that if circumstances were different, the stranger that you just crossed to the other side of the street to avoid, the stranger staring at you from the bus stop, the stranger counting out change to pay for their groceries, could be you, could be me. When we break those cultural patterns of generations, when we break with the current wisdom, when we break our self-imposed rules, every time, we are the ones who receive mercy. See, it wasn't the man with the view from the ditch that received the mercy that day. It was the stranger who took the chance and stopped to help. That, my friends, is the work of grace in the world. That is the good news that we celebrate every single Sunday. That is the grace that comes when we begin to see the stranger as our friend. That's the grace that comes when we decide not to be bound by our own anger and helplessness. That's the grace that comes when we realize that the stranger in our midst isn't really a stranger, but a neighbor that we haven't yet met, but we know in God's eyes we're all the same. We're all children, clamoring for God's love and attention, God's blessing. Black, yellow, brown, white, freckled, Jewish, Muslim, Catholic, Baptist, yes, even Methodist. We're all the same. We can continue to isolate ourselves. We can continue to cross to the other side of the road, to hide behind our excuses, and I'm included here. We can continue to tell ourselves it's not our problem. But if we do, we are denying ourselves the mercy that only stopping what we're doing and reaching out to another human being can bring. It's time, past time, to break a few rules. It's time to put a little passion in our compassion. It's time to challenge ourselves. It's time to show a little faith and to go and do likewise. Because whether we stop and help the stranger on the road or we will be passed by and there will be no mercy. I said at the beginning of this sermon that the more things change, the more they stay the same. It doesn't need to be that way. It never needs to be that way. Jesus came that there might be a new kingdom. Go, do likewise. Be a neighbor. Rely on the mercy of a stranger and receive grace upon grace. And God's mercy made just.